Okay, I think we can get started. I can invite the other panelists to share their screen, to share their cameras with us. I'm delighted for this opportunity to host this event. This has been one event that I was particularly excited for since the start of this academic year. Let me introduce myself briefly. My name is Asaf Lubin. I'm an associate professor of law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law and a faculty fellow at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research here at Indiana University. And anyone who knows me knows two facts about me for sure. One is that I'm a happily gay married man, and the other is that I've been researching espionage regulation for the better half of the last decade. And for a very long time, those two facts are ones that did not have a correlation between them and ones that I had struggled to find the vocabulary to put together. And then I read Professor Manjikian's book, which we will be talking about today, Gender, Sexuality, and Intelligence Studies, The Spy in the Closet, which if you have not yet bought, this is now your reminder to do just that because it's such a terrific book. And the second I read it the first time, as I was telling my partner, I felt like the book was different than any other academic piece of writing I've ever read. It went beyond the mere intellectual stimulating piece and into a realm that I would identify as biographical. It had allowed me to define and see the world in different lens, a world that I had experienced myself a mere 10 years before. And so I knew I had to invite Professor Manjikian to come give a talk about this book. I'm so delighted that she's here with us. And so what I'll do in just a couple minutes is just introduce the two speakers joining me today, and we'll then take it away. The format for today's webinar will be that Professor Manjikian will give about 15 to 20 minutes of a presentation about her agenda and methodology in setting up this book, followed by comments by both Professor Colin Johnson and myself. And then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. Please feel free during the entire presentation to use the Q&A function to share your questions without, and I will guarantee at the end of the presentations that we will have time to address your questions. We will aim to end promptly at the hour, maybe a little minute or two after that. And so with that, let me introduce our great panelists. The first is Dr. Mary Manjikian. She is a professor at the Robertson School of Government at Regent University, a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with service in the Netherlands, Russia, and Bulgaria. Manjikian was a Fulbright Scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study at Durham University. She has also served as an external research associate at the U.S. Army War College. She has taught courses in comparative politics, international relations theory, national security affairs, terrorism, politics and the media, and environmental politics. And besides gender, sexuality, and intelligence studies, Professor Manjikian has published an extensive collection of written work. I can possibly name it all, but perhaps most notable to this audience is Apocalypse and Post-Politics, The Romance of the End in 2012, Cybersecurity Ethics and Introduction, published in 2017, and most recently, Introduction to Cyber Politics and Policy, published just last year. We are also joined by Professor Colin Johnson, who is an associate professor at Indiana University's Department of Gender Studies, as well as an adjunct associate professor at the Departments of American Studies, History, and Human Biology. His research focuses on the history of gender and sexuality in the United States during the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. He has taught such courses as queer theory, concepts of gender, history of feminist thought and practice, gay history, queer cultures, and sex, gender, and the body. Johnson also has a vast body of written work, including two books that I'll mention now. One is Just Queer Folks, Gender and Sexuality in Rural America from 2013, and his co-authored Queering in the Countryside, New Frontiers in Rural Queer Studies from 2016. Finally, I'll just mention the sponsoring student body that has helped or put this event together, which is the Indiana University Maurer School of Law LGBTQ+ project here at the school, which provides pro bono legal research and advocacy services to Indiana LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations. And the project engages law students, attorneys, scholars, and LGBTQ+ advocates to address the unmet legal needs of Indiana's LGBTQ+ community and support equality efforts across Indiana organizations. And with that, I will stop talking and we'll hand it over to Mary to begin her presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be speaking with you all today. I'll try not to take too much time, and I'm thrilled to hear that several of you have read this book and that you have kind of strong opinions, hopefully, about it. I'm just going to start out with my disclaimer. The views and opinions stated in this presentation are my own, do not reflect the views or opinions of my employer or my university. I kind of put this together. I suggested I was going to do two things today: present my work suggesting why queer theory is an appropriate lens for looking at the role of U.S. intelligence in international relations, and kind of hopefully open up the floor for a little bit of discussion about whether or not queer theory should be used in this way. I've been accused of kind of mangling the theory, kind of colonializing it and applying it to something where it doesn't apply. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation. So kind of how did this project come about? How in the world did I come to bring these two kind of disparate ideas together, the idea of queer theory and the idea of the intelligence community? Well, I want to give you a little something to ponder. Here's an article that appeared last year in the press, and it says Chinese authorities reportedly killed or jailed more than a dozen of the CIA sources in the country from 2010 to 2012. And we're told that the people from the intelligence community that spoke about these deaths were speaking anonymously. It's described as a previously undisclosed spy saga. And so we don't even know exactly how many CIA assets were killed during this period. Somewhere between 18 and 20, at least 12 were killed. And it all seems to kind of come from hearsay and rumor. Three of the officials said one of those killed was executed in front of his colleagues in an apparent message to other CIA assets working in the country. And this gets you an example of kind of how strange it is to deal with the Intel community. We don't know exactly how many people died. We don't know exactly what the circumstances are. And perhaps, strangely enough, nobody seems particularly upset about it. If there were 10 or 12 civilians reportedly killed in China, everyone would be very concerned. We'd be very concerned if 10 or 12 military officers were killed. We'd certainly be concerned if 10 or 12 diplomats were killed. And so it suggests that there's something odd about the intelligence community as part of sort of the US foreign policy apparatus. They appear to somehow be both extremely significant and extremely powerful if you listen to the people who talk about the deep state. And at the same time, they appear to have kind of fewer rights than other people. They can be killed in their families. People might not even know how or why. And so this gives us kind of a beginning about how to think about the Intel community. It doesn't seem to follow any of the normal rules of international relations. Normally, if something like this happened, a series of assassinations, there'd be all kinds of diplomatic reports, there'd be all kinds of statements from the president. And this kind of appeared in the back pages of a newspaper, and it just seemed like, well, there's something different about the Intel community, isn't there? And so I want to start you off with this picture. This is, they call it the Wall of Heroes, and it appears at CIA headquarters. And this is the only memorial you get if you're killed in service working for the CIA. And what's unusual about this memorial, if you notice, is there's no names. Each of those stars represents someone from the Intel community who was killed in the line of duty, but we don't even know their names. And so I suggest that sort of the Intel agents and the Intel community has kind of a different sort of status. They're not really part of US foreign policy. They don't comply with international law. You're allowed to violate sovereignty. You're allowed to interfere in elections. You're allowed to perhaps even assassinate people if you work for the Intel community. They're not publicly out about their status as agents. They clearly have fewer protections, and they may not be publicly claimed by their government in situations where they are found out. And so I began to think, well, it's weird to have an open secret in US foreign policy. And so I just want to sort of call your attention to these maps here. These are two maps that kind of analysts have come up with. The first one in the top left is a situation where they were trying to figure out how many extraordinary renditions had taken place. How many times had the US government turned an asset over to another country knowing that perhaps they might be tortured. And so there's this map here. It says, you know, we think there's this huge number of these things happening, and these are all the places where they're happening. In the map underneath is a map of so-called black prisons. Once again, this idea that if the US or a European country turns an asset over to another country, perhaps for torture or interrogation, these are the places where we believe people are being held. And what was interesting to me about this was about the same time I was wondering if there was an overlap between Intell and queer theory. I found a number of these types of maps. This is a map that a community of scholars came up with in New York City, and they were trying to figure out where the gay neighborhoods had been in New York City during the 20th century. And so if you recall, during the early 20th century, it would have been illegal to register as a gay couple cohabiting. So something like census data would not have included that information. And so instead, the geographers talk about kind of undertaking a research project, kind of collecting intelligence, if you will, trying to find out from census data where there are a lot of places where there were unrelated people of the same gender living together for an extended period of time. And so this idea of kind of mapping open secrets, taking something that had been hidden and kind of bringing it out into the light. It struck me that there was a lot of similarity between those sort of black prison and extraordinary rendition maps and the kind of work that was being done by people like queer geographers. So this is kind of what I look at in this book is I say, well, can we describe kind of spying the Intell community as kind of the closeted side of American foreign policy, something which exists and can be mapped and observed, but is not publicly acknowledged at the time. And in chapter 5, I talk about, I love memoirs, and I talk about some of the memoirs by CIA officers in which they, in a sense, kind of come out. They reveal themselves as Intell officers, and they explicitly claim that status. And I think this really matters for foreign policy and for public policy. How does the US government, it's been notoriously bad at exercising oversight and accountability over the intelligence community. Well, how do you exercise oversight and accountability over something which is basically an open secret? The US spends $1 trillion on national security programs, and yet we seem to know precious little about how many people work for the Intell community and where exactly they're located and what exactly they do. And certainly it matters ethically that there are people who work for the government who don't have a formalized dissent channel the way the State Department does, and who often seem to end up kind of the subject of, for example, Senate Intell accountability proceedings. It seems like often when there is an inquiry into kind of CIA overstepping, what ends up happening is we really don't get any reform of the organization, but one or more people may end up going to jail. So that's what I was interested in, is kind of what is it like to be someone within that group who's kind of invisible and doesn't have status. People who study the Intell community, they often talk about something called intelligence exceptionalism, where they say the Intell community is completely different than any other actor in foreign policy. It doesn't play by the same rules. It doesn't have the same standard. And in the book, I talk about how when we talk about intelligence, we often find ourselves using very moralistic language. When I teach this to my students, I often start and I say, this is a picture of Dante's Inferno, and isn't it neat that at the bottom of it, isn't it interesting that treason is considered sort of a deeply moral failing as well as kind of a political failing. It's not just another crime. And so I have a whole chapter in the book where I talk about this idea of treason, the idea that if you join the Intell community, you become like a member of a secret society. And so that if you sell secrets, if you sell intelligence, you collude with an adversary, you're regarded as, in a sense, kind of having sinned as well as having kind of broken a rule. And so in the book, I argue that the reason that the Intel community gets treated like a deviant actor is because otherwise sort of US foreign policy as a whole would have to admit that actually what the CIA does, covert and clandestine operations, actually are part of our foreign policy. And so situations where sort of the US gets caught, sort of as Reagan did in the Iran-Contra scandal, it's easier to say, oh, sort of the CIA was acting on its own, it was acting as a rogue actor. This has nothing to do with US foreign policy. So in the book, I suggest that the US has sort of an overt and then a covert foreign policy, and that the international relations theory literature really doesn't do a good job of considering the ways in which Intel activities actually are part of foreign policy. So I talk about the CIA as a deviant actor, sort of we have hard power, which is military, and sort of military power is closely regulated by things like the law of armed conflict. The US president is the commander in chief. We have soft power diplomacy. The US Constitution gives the president to make treaties and declare war. But there's nothing about the Intel community in the Constitution. There's nothing about the role of the president with the Intel community. And essentially because of that, it's really kind of up to the whims of whoever the president is. It kind of emerges out of norm and precedent rather than law. And so I suggest that by using queer theory, we can bring the discussion of the Intel community and its activities better into conversation about academic international relations. We can also bring it into a kind of the larger world of things that are queer. And this is something we can talk about more. Because what I'm doing here is I'm really saying that something is queer if it's dynamic, it's not belonging to a fixed category. It's hidden, it's difficult to theorize about because it's not publicly acknowledged, and its behavior, which is defined as deviant or outside traditional norms. So a lot of the criticism that I received for this book thus far was kind of about this idea that you're using queer theory as a methodology, and you're using it as a standpoint. You're allowing these actors to speak within the Intel community. But how in the world is this book emancipatory? If queer theory is something which is emancipatory, my God, you are defending the intelligence community. How can that be? And so people said to me, can we claim that the IC is being victimized in some way? And is that really ever appropriate? So essentially what people have said is the work doesn't share the normative stance or emancipatory thrust of other work which uses this methodology. I see what you're doing, but I'm not exactly sure what your end game is. And so since then, I've been thinking a lot about the idea that queer theory really has three parts. It's an epistemological stance, paradigm or lens, it's a method of inquiry, and it's also a project. And I would argue that by bringing the Intel community into how we think about foreign policy, that too is an important project. It's important to kind of get state actors to own what it is that they're doing and not let them, in a sense, kind of get away with saying this isn't really our foreign policy, this is deviant foreign policy. But the question really is, can we decouple epistemological stances, methodology, and normative stances? And Laura Schoberg, who's an IR theorist, has been writing a lot about this in relation to other major IR paradigms. And so sort of the quote that I guess I'm going to leave you with, because I think I'm running out of time here, is by Judith Butler. She says, queer is the thing which is in the present never fully owned, but always and only redeployed, twisted, queered from a prior usage, and in the direction of urgent and expanding political purposes. So it's been suggested that sort of if Judith Butler were dead, she'd be rolling over in her grave at what I have done with queer theory, because arguably, it's not necessarily moving in the direction of urgent and expanded political purposes. I see that I am now at my time, 12:22. So I'm going to go ahead and end this presentation, and I'm going to kind of hear what the other speakers have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Mary. This was terrific. Colin, do you want to join us?
Yeah. So First of all, let me start my timer so that I can use Mary's example, follow Mary's good example and try to keep to time. So the first thing I want to say is it was really a distinct pleasure to read this book and to be involved in this conversation. I want to begin by thanking Asa for inviting me to participate in it, and especially to thank Mary for having written the volume that occasioned our coming together this afternoon. This is international relations is not my area. Queer theory maybe is a bit more. And I think if one thing is characteristic of queer theorizing, it's the kind of leaning into the catalytic possibilities of crossing boundaries. And so I really appreciate having the opportunity to be part of that today. So I want to begin just briefly by saying that I thought that this book actually resonated with me on several levels. Obviously, as somebody who teaches queer theory, it spoke to my scholarly interests, or at least part of them. But I also, and at the risk of devolving momentarily into autobiography and memoir in deference to Mary's appreciation for that genre, it also spoke to me on a personal level because my maternal grandfather was actually an intelligence officer. He began his career in intelligence in 1943 when he was transferred to the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, which was the precursor to the CIA. And when he worked for the OSS, he oversaw the packing of small arms and other equipment to be delivered to local resistance fighters in occupied France. In 1950, he actually joined the CIA, where he worked as an air operations officer until his retirement in 1971, which was actually prior to my birth. I am told in family lore that during that time, he regularly used his status as a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserve as a cover when he was working in Europe, as he often did. What this means, among other things, is that he was almost certainly involved in the operation of the U-2 spy plane program during the height of the Cold War, and possibly involved in Air America in Southeast Asia as well, at least if his longest postings at Air Force bases in Ankara, Turkey, and later Honolulu were any indicators of what he was up to at various points in his career. Crucially, however, no one in my family has ever been able to get, or was able to get, what they felt like was an entirely straight answer out of him about what he did, or any of this actually. And of course, in this context, I use the phrase straight answer advisedly. In fact, I think it's that dynamic, which at various points this book addresses in very kind of specific and for me, very resonant terms, that is one of the most kind of interesting and compelling aspects of the book. Its attempt to kind of name, theorize, and describe the sense of general dis-ease that people actually who are proximate to the intelligence enterprise inevitably feel by virtue of its own kind of surreptitiousness, structure, and mode of operation. So I want to thank Mary first for that, because as a queer theorist, I kind of like dis-ease when I encounter it, and I certainly like having a way to think about it. I had actually never thought about my grandfather's career, for example, and its kind of weird relation to my own status as a gay man until I read this book and had occasion to really think about those things. So first, by way of Thanksgiving, I would note that. The second thing that I want to say is that, and Mary spoke about this a little in her presentation, one of the things that I really love about this book is the framing of national intelligence is what she refers to as deviant foreign policy, and espionage as what she refers to as a perverse form of surveillance. These are themes that are returned to again and again throughout the book, and they're themes that I think are worth discussing more, particularly in this group. They're enabling not only, in my estimation, not only because they provide us with a new way to think about the relation between the official and the unofficial. If I had to kind of describe in some regards what queer theory is really good at, providing wrenching renamings for things that give us a kind of different vantage point on them and a way to think critically about them is one of the things that queer theory has, again, in my experience, always excelled at. So new names between the official and the unofficial, between the avowed and the disavowed. But I also think it's useful because I think that these terms or refigurations help to capture and make explicit both the moralistic logic that always subtends self-legitimating systems and the highly selective exception-making such systems tend to engage in on their own behalf, which I think is, again, a theme that kind of comes out in the book. I would love it, actually, if Mary could say a bit more about these themes, but I would also invite, frankly, those in attendance today to consider the applicability of this framing to their own areas of professional practice and expertise, because particularly when I think about the law, I think there are all sorts of of things about the practice of the law that could actually be productively reframed as the kind of deviant other of an official and kind of properly accepted mode of procedural execution of professional responsibilities. And I certainly think there are perverse aspects of most professional realms and sets of conventions that would be worth thinking about. Second, I was grateful for the book's exploration of the association between the homosexual as an historical figure and the spy, particularly its elaboration of the ways that being gay might, and perhaps sometimes actually is, understood as an asset or qualifying attribute for those actively engaged in intelligence work, which is something that's discussed in the middle of the book. I say this because traditionally the story that gets told about homosexuality and national security is almost exclusively about the liability that gay men and lesbians were always already assumed to be by virtue of their susceptibility to blackmail, which is of course itself a kind of interesting story, since most of the things that made gay men and lesbians susceptible to blackmail were actually like produced by the very state that then cited those things as evidence of why they should be separated from the kind of national security business of the country. But I think here in the book, we see a much more subtle discussion of that relationship. And again, I'm quite grateful for that. The third thing that I was struck by when reading the book, and this is really the place where I guess as a kind of queer theorist, I don't necessarily know that I think that this book mangles queer theory, but I do think that it applies it fairly selectively in ways that are worth discussing. And this is a place where I think in some regard, my instincts as a kind of person who teaches queer theory and kind of muddles around in it raise some questions. I was struck when reading the book by the insight thinking about intelligence from this perspective provides into the tensions inherent in the democratic state. As Merritt points out, one of the potential consequences of intelligence activities being revealed is that nominally democratic states that justify their censorious stance towards non or explicitly anti-democratic states in terms of the former's supposed respect for and adherence to the rule of law might be revealed to be not so democratic in this sense, at least after all, right? Which is a very interesting dynamic about this that really struck me when I was reading. As a queer theorist, I read this observation of Mary's as a riff on Sedgwick's discussion in Epistemology of the Closet of the tension between what Sedgwick refers to as a minoritizing understanding of homosexuality on the one hand and a universalizing one on the other. And I can say a bit more about that in the context of the Q&A if people are unfamiliar with Sedgwick's work. In the book, this tension seems to be, Mary's book, I mean, this tension seems to be explored mostly for the purpose of drawing a parallel between the ordeal of individuals being outed as homosexuals and governments being outed as hypocritical actors, both in the eyes of other governments and in some cases, I would say particularly in the case of US behavior, in the eyes of their own citizens. And there are fairly extensive discussions of incidents like the Iran-Contra affair and a number of others that had the effect of raising questions about essentially the kind of hypocrisy and lawlessness of the US government transacting business under the sign of national intelligence activities. I'm certainly intrigued by this analogy, but I also think it's worth pointing out that the tension Sedgwick describes between a minoritizing understanding of homosexuality and a universalizing one has as much to do with the thorny notion of latency, or the imminent potential in all of us to be genuinely different than we think we are, often despite ourselves, as it does with the notion of concealed truths unwillingly or inconveniently disclosed to others, be they family members or foreign governments. In my estimation, the book is fairly clear about what this means in the context of international relations. I do wonder what the book's analysis of this dynamic might be able to teach us about intra-national dynamics, however. Particularly given the recent recognition that one of the greatest threats to American national security is domestic right-wing extremism in the United States. It does seem to me that one thing the United States adversaries have always known about our country is that it has the potential to become something quite different than what it is, in part because what it is has arguably always been internally riven and riddled with contradictions. The Soviet Union was certainly aware of this during the Cold War. I would argue the US government was aware of it as well, at least if its wholesale investment in the cause of anti-communism is any indication of its fear of what American society could easily become if left to its own devices or left unprotected from the influence of national actors that had an interest in actually recruiting people to the cause of communism. And of course, these days, it seems fairly obvious that it is American society's latently fascist tendencies that its adversaries are seeking not just to expose in the manner of an outing, which is the kind of paradigm that's put forward or discussed in the book, but to actively cultivate, to unleash, to sensitize Americans to the fact that they already have. And it seems to me in that regard that there's another layer to the discussion that is implied by the work that Mary has already done, which is not just the layer of the outing of governments as sort of hypocritical on the international stage, or the calling into question of governments in the eyes of their own citizens, but really and truly the foundational kind of precept that nations are always susceptible to be fundamentally transform, perhaps most dangerously from within, and that itself may actually be a kind of driving force or a realm of potential in the operation of intelligence, espionage, and international relations that is being more aggressively exploited these days than ever before. Finally, I just wanted to note, I would love to hear Mary say a bit more about gender in this book. There are moments in the book where certainly I see invocations of Butler's work and the work of other people as being kind of squarely in dialogue with the kind of modality of gender studies that I'm familiar with. And after reading it, it's fairly clear to me what theorists of gender have to teach theorists of IR and critical intelligence studies. It's less clear to me, however, what IR and critical intelligence studies has to teach theorists of gender. And that's really an area where I would love to hear kind of Mary say a bit more. I teach feminist theory as well as queer theory. So of course, one of the natural questions I always have is, does this book have feminist investments? If so, what are they? And what would the book look like if it was actually a kind of feminist analysis that was centered as opposed to a queer analysis? So with those questions, I'll sort of wrap up my initial comments and turn the floor over to Asaf.
Thank you so much. And I'll just start by saying that I would sign on to everything you just said in terms of feedback. And I thought it was terrific comments. Let me offer one important observation, which I think has not yet been mentioned about the book. And it is the smooth transition between the individual and the agency, or between the individual and the state. One of the benefits that I have found in reading the book is the movement that Mary does between talking about the experiences of individual spies and the experiences of intelligences and apparatus of the state. And I think that is in part what provides that vocabulary that I think was so far missing in our ability to articulate the work of intelligence agencies through a queer lens. And so to the extent, Mary, that you have been criticized for having a project that is not sufficiently emancipatory, I would just suggest to you that move in speaking about the experiences of individual spies has certainly liberated and emancipated me. And in that sense has given me a new found way of dealing with my past and thinking through my past in a new way that was at time liberating. So I have four comments, and all four of my comments speak to my identity as a lawyer. And so they're all tied in some way to normative questions that are derived from the research you're doing. And it's not necessarily to push you to provide those normative answers. Really, the descriptive work you're doing in this piece and providing those languages by itself a huge contribution. But nonetheless, it's kind of where the next step is for me in trying to pick up your work and situate it within my own. And so I would love to kind of throw those ideas to you and hear your thoughts about them. So the first is a story you tell in the book at great length in page 115, which ties to security clearances in a case that made its way all the way to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. In that case called High-Tech Gaze versus Defend Industrial Security Clearance Office, or DISCO, in 1990, a group of gay defense contractors undertook a class action suit against the agency known as DISCO, which was responsible for undertaking security clearance for all defense contractors. And part of what they were challenging is the fact that they were denied security clearance because of the fact that their identities as gay men was identified by their employer. And this is because DISCO had a manual which stated in part that acts of sexual misconduct, including indications of moral turpitude, heterosexual promiscuity, deviant or bizarre sexual conduct or behavior, transsexualism, and so on and so forth, including their homosexuality, might be those categories that would justify certainly additional scrutiny, if not a denial of clearance. And ultimately, the court says that how the KGB could utilize certain types of behaviors as leverage in recruiting individuals to conduct espionage on their behalf could be a good reason for why the government might deny clearance. And so while we might not consider it deviant, the fact that our enemies do, and the fact that our enemies might utilize that as leverage, is certainly a justification for doing so. When I was going through my own individual security clearance back at the age of 17, that is about 17 years ago, 18 years ago, I was asked a question during my lie detector test, and the question was, do you have skeletons in your closet? And I recall preparing days in advance, me, a gay closeted man, to a question like that might come up. And I remember my heart falling down to my pants when the question was asked. And I remember playing so hard in my head that being gay is not a skeleton, and therefore I should not worry when I answer to the officer that no, I have no skeletons in my closet. Of course, being a closeted man, that was certainly a huge skeleton that has in different ways impacted me throughout my life. And so I wonder, recognized that at the same time during my own intelligence work, I had used sexual orientation as a basis by which identifying weaknesses in potential targets for human intelligence collection. I recognize why this is a potential security weakness that merits potential review and perhaps merits the very question that was asked of me. While simultaneously, I recognize my own personal victimhood in being asked that question in that moment. And so it is those kinds of moments that only the intelligence profession presents that leave me in a sense where I don't know what the good answer is on this. And so I would posit to both panels, because obviously your story ends at page 115 without you articulating what you think about the court's judgment in that case. I'll be curious to hear more about what your thoughts about that decision. The second point I want to raise concerns something that I wrote a lot about called just intelligence. Now, just intelligence is a theory in intelligence studies and moral philosophy that suggests that we can apply the same doctrines of just war theory to intelligence studies. That is to say that we can regulate intelligence at three distinct temporal stages: before, during, and after. For those international lawyers in the room, use ad, use in, use post. And that regulation could address both the justifications for spying as a matter of international law, the means and conduct of spying, which methods and which targets you choose in the context of spying, and then accountability mechanism post factum. And especially for that second category, relying on the rich body of just war theory, these scholars, many of them are former intelligence professionals, have all suggested we adopt principles of proportionality, necessity, adequate safeguards, reasonableness, efficacy, as standards that would determine the legality of different kinds of intelligence operations. And I recall in 2014 when a group of 8200 is the unit in Israel that is the equivalent of the NSA that engages in signal intelligence collection, had come out with what is now known as the Refuseniks letter, and had suggested that they do not want to engage anymore in intelligence for the government in their reserves duties, in part because of the fact that the Israeli intelligence has been engaging in collection of immense information about Palestinians, many of them innocent Palestinians, and some of the collection involving specifically their sexual orientation had driven them to the decision of not engaging anymore in that practice. And I wonder again, the legality or illegality, morality or immorality, justifications of ethical concern or not, principles of proportionality, necessity, adequacy, as they relate to the collection of information about sexual orientation by targets. And how should we conceive of that practice, which is not an Israeli practice? Indeed, as the book demonstrates, it's a practice that is as historical as it is commonplace. Is this something that is justified or unjustified? In the words of one of the authors of that Refuseniks letter, should we, in the practice of human intelligence, should we really be looking at the weakness points in a human? Should that be part of the job of an intelligence profession? And what does that mean of us as a practice that has a role to play in global politics, that we search to deteriorate certain pressure points in another human, so to turn him over into a counteragent, an informant, and so on and so forth. But perhaps the last question I want to pose comes at the end of the book, where Professor Mary Manjikian correctly identifies the normalization of espionage, indeed, the coming out of intelligence of the proverbial closet. And you write at the end in page 275 that now that intelligence activities have perhaps emerged from the closet and have been brought out into the light, observers may have a more realistic and less romanticized view of what it is that intelligence community does. Today, intelligence activities are no longer treated as either dashing, adventurous, or romantic in the manner of a James Bond film, nor are they treated primarily as immoral and unethical as they may have been the media during the Vietnam War, for example. They have been, quote, normalized in the sense that they have now regarded as sometimes boring, highly bureaucratic, and merely another part of the foreign policy apparatus. And the reason I'm struck by that statement, which I agree in general terms is true, we have certainly since the Cold War have seen a shedding of light on the intelligence practice, the legalization of the profession, an entry into statutory law as to how foreign intelligence is to be collected, analyzed, promulgated across most democratic states, and indeed a body of jurisprudence from the European Court of Human Rights, which we could have not imagined a mere 20 years ago about how foreign intelligence is to be done. And yet at the same time, many of my colleagues in the international law community deny any attempt to engage with intelligence in a meaningful sense. I'm always struck by the work of Professor Radson, published in 2007 in the Michigan Journal of International Law, a paper called The Unresolved Equation of Espionage in International Law, in which he literally writes that those who wish to do research on espionage in international law should, quote, move to other projects with grace. He says in that article that we should accept the laws of physics, that we cannot turn water into wine at weddings. And in so doing, we should not attempt the unimaginable, the unregulatable. That international law and espionage are antithetical to each other, and that espionage should remain an unregulatable practice. Indeed, again, I'll refer back to that Refuseniks letter from 2014 in Israel. One of those authors wrote, and I quote, that there are no laws governing military intelligence, only diplomacy and international relations. That's intelligence. It's pretty dirty, but that's the inherent rules of the game. Indeed, for most internationalists, espionage remains a dirty word, a taboo word, that divergent thing that we should exclude ourselves from conversation. So I'm curious, why is it, you think, that while we have seen some normalization of the practice, that has not yet translated into the mindset and psyche and writing of most international legal scholars? And so with that, I would end my comments and perhaps invite Mary, because we've obviously bombarded you with some of our thoughts, to take a moment to respond.
Thank you so much for the kind words and the comments. I'm going to start with a few of Asaf's comments, because I think I have better notes on those, and then I will try to address some of Colin's issues as well. When you talk about the story about the security clearance, and you ask kind of, how do I think it should be resolved, and how do I see it, realizing kind of later on, the sort of framework that it fits into is this idea that deviance connotes risk, right? And the thing is that the deviance itself is not actually what makes the person or the situation risky. Rather, it's how society kind of designates what is deviant, and then goes on to kind of give it a risk factor. And so I think that's an important kind of way to think about it, because we do know that now, if provided you are open about your sexuality, it does not necessarily mean you can't be cleared. So in that sense, it suggests that sort of taking ownership of that behavior then allows you to also take ownership of how people think about risk. I was actually talking with a student of mine the other day in a class I teach on health security, and she was talking about people within the health community, like doctors and nurses, who are suspicious of Western medicine. And you begin to think of them as kind of a deviant group. And she was talking about, nurses who won't get vaccinated. And so once again, that pairing of kind of having a deviant view within a particular security nexus, and that therefore making you a risk, I think is kind of a universal way of thinking about how those objects fit together. This question of kind of, can we apply just war to intelligence? Can we come up with some sort of universal set of regulatory practices? I delved into this question a little bit a couple of years ago. I wrote an article, and it's called "But My Hands Are Clean." And it's actually on the ethics of complicity in intelligence sharing. And what I was really struck by were all these situations of extraordinary rendition where the United States would do something like they turn a suspected terrorist over to Pakistan to interrogate. And then they would kind of completely unproblematically profit from that intelligence. And as I was casting around for kind of an ethical lens to look at that problem, I came up with the phrase fair trade intelligence. And I talked about things like, deciding to buy clothing even though you suspected it may have been made by child labor, or that chocolate that you really like where the beans are being harvested by children. And the idea that in some situations, people sort of choose to look the other way, but that ultimately it's an ethical choice. Do I pay attention to this? And in what circumstances do I kind of write myself a pass? And there's some really great philosophy literature about complicity. And they talk about, if you're working at your desk and you suspect that your coworker is taking home a computer that isn't his, is that different than if he's taking home something really heavy and he asks you to help carry it? And so it's a question of kind of how complicit are you and how embedded are you in those practices? So I think that that's one way of thinking about it, sort of the fact that the United States clearly is complicit. If you give someone over to the Pakistanis to be tortured, you're complicit. That's a human rights violation. You can claim you didn't know. But I think complicity is a really interesting way of thinking about this. So I wrote this piece in an academic journal, and months later, I actually saw an interview with the head of Britain's GCHQ, and he used the phrase fair trade intelligence. And I thought, well, that's kind of neat, if I kind of talked about that and people are actually thinking about it. So that may be one way to think about it. And then sort of in my own work, sometimes I talk about the notion of instrumentality, basically using someone else as a means to an end versus kind of, human rights, which sort of builds on the dignity of each individual. And the thing about sort of the intelligence sharing piece that I wrote was that intelligence sharing arrangements, with the exception of the Five Eyes, are almost completely ad hoc. They're kind of created on sort of an individual basis. And that's why I think it's so hard often to regulate sort of human rights and behavior within Intel, is so often it's not sort of specifically kind of written down as a treaty. It's often really dynamic rather than static. And I think that's something we need to think about. So going on to kind of Collins' issues as well. Let's see. Well, I love this piece that you talked about where you said, that sort of kind of our adversaries know who we really are. We're a nation of, 1/3 of us support, autocracy. 1/3 of us would like to have a leader that looks like Putin, and somehow or other they're aware of that. And it seems to me that what we're really talking about is performativity, right? that sort of in the international system, the United States presents itself not only as a democratic nation, but maybe as a nation of democratically oriented individuals. And so that's really kind of, I think, where sort of the unmasking maybe then comes from, is this idea that sort of, you know, Russia knows who we really are, you know, and a lot of us would have voted for Putin if he'd been on the ballot, you know. And it's kind of a scary thought, really, but I think that in a sense, by kind of unmasking who the U.S. is on the international stage, it does sort of lead into that kind of peeling it back and kind of unmasking who sort of the United States is as a group of people. And that again is sort of, I love that word latency, right? Because it suggests that sort of we do have sort of, you know, a latent autocratic soul, or at least some of us do. And that's, I think, a very interesting kind of note. And then you'd ask about sort of what can critical IR theory kind of teach kind of feminism, or kind of how can it be used to sort of broaden that larger discussion? And there's quite a bit of writing right now on things like emotions in international relations. What does it mean for a nation to say that it seeks revenge or that it forgives someone? Can we talk about sort of nations having feelings? And I suppose the greatest change there really is that sort of historically, when we talked about nations, we kind of viewed them as I think masculine. They were unitary, particularly in realism. You know, they were kind of very decisive, and so I think this idea of kind of asking if a nation can have sort of more than one presentation may be useful for people that are working more broadly, perhaps in those gender fields. Thank you.
Colin, before I already see that we have a question in the Q&A, but before we move to those, I was curious if you wanted to respond in any way or have anything else to say before we do that.
Oh, I would just say, I mean, those responses were really helpful and clarifying. I guess the thing is, the issue with latency, which is I think an aspect of queer theory that often gets overlooked, is that it's the part of queer theorizing that always kind of implants in people the potential to be otherwise. So I guess I would say, when I was thinking about it, it seems to me like there's this weird dynamic that is kind of revealed in the way that states interact with one another, and which is, for example, the idea that the United States might be latently fascist in a way that could be exploited. And the irony actually of the US's explicit foreign policy that is perhaps less objectionable, at least from an American perspective, is the idea that autocratic societies could be latently democratic, right? And in fact, our foreign policy depends on the idea that autocratic societies could be latently democratic. And so latency is partly about what we are collectively, but it's also about what we have the potential to become. And that certainly is that one of the tensions that Sedgwick identifies in the kind of modern construction of homosexuality. It's on the one hand deeply ontologizing, right? You are a homosexual in our kind of understanding of things, but it's also, it leans in the direction of undecidability, which is why in Epistemology of the Closet, she talks a lot about the gay panic defense, right? Which is this idea that everybody's implicated in this in ways that are actually about the management of power and really the distribution of kind of vulnerability to death and injustice by virtue of the fact that one could say I killed someone because of the fact that I discovered kind of latent potential in myself that essentially made me momentarily beyond my. So it's really about future potential, and it seems to me that future potential does factor into foreign policy. It's not just a kind of static, let's maintain the status quo. It always has designs on a future, that where the world aligns more productively with national values. And so the idea of figuring out what we have the latent potential to become or whatever is really central to IR thinking, even if it doesn't necessarily think in terms of latency as far as I can tell.
As we have 4 more minutes, why don't we, I have a personal question I want to leave Mary off with, but I will So I'll ask that question and the question from the audience. So the question from the audience asks about that tension between the individual and the institution. And they're particularly wondering to what extent is the terminology of outing, when moved away from the individual back to the institutional level, still plays a useful normative role, noting that outing a government for, say, committing human rights violations seems notably different from outing a queer person. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. And then my question to you, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the reporting that had just come out about a massive Chinese cyber espionage operation, which follows in the footsteps of a massive Russian cyber operations against US agencies and organizations. Right at the end of the book, you have started talking about, in brief, in a few pages, about the world we're moving towards, a world in which a lot of this will be done in automated, artificial intelligence-based ways that separate the individual spy or intelligence officers from a lot of the dirty work. And so I'd be curious to hear, almost in conclusion, kind of how you see the world of espionage evolving in relation to some of the themes that you describe in the book.
Those are some challenging questions. I think the issue about sort of outing a state is that it's often very sort of calculated and it's instrumental, whether it's the media that's kind of calling a state to account and they're saying, look, you did this thing that you previously never admitted to, that you claim is not part of your personality, but it actually is. I think that in both cases, it's kind of about an identity, and it's about sort of asking someone, if they care to embrace their entire identity, or if there's something to be gained by sort of that integration of sort of the bifurcated identity. And I think sort of what I talk about in the book is when we have these sort of very formal performances in sort of the Senate Intell committee hearings about sort of perceived violations by the US Intel community. The United States has never done that. The United States has never said, you know what, we're right. We do some stuff that's really bad and we claim to be democratic and here we are, we aren't. And I talk about how in those hearings, it's a type of performance aimed at sort of discounting that kind of perverse international relations and kind of shoving it back into the closet and kind of not claiming that identity. But I think in that way, it's a useful metaphor to think about kind of, what would it look like, sort of Colin talks about sort of what does the United States have the potential to be, what would the United States look like if it did claim that identity, if it said, you know what, we do these things, we also do these things. And as you were speaking, Colin, I was struck by many years ago, I taught a course at the Joint Forces Staff College, which is for kind of high-ranking military officers. And we were talking about kind of journalistic ethics and how you report terrorist operations in the field. And what I heard from a lot of these military officers is, we wish we could do the things that kind of the bad guys did, because it would be so much faster and so much more efficient than having to obey all these regulations. And I was really struck by that sort of they regarded kind of sometimes having to operate through these democratic norms as kind of like being hobbled or something. In terms of kind of in the future, are we going to kind of outsource this all to the machines and then claim that, we're not complicit because we didn't do it? And there's a lot of conversation in sort of the community that talks about the ethics of drones, and they talk about exactly those things, if God forbid, the drone attack was supposed to be on a terrorist base and instead it was on a schoolyard, who's ultimately responsible for that? Is it the designer? Is it the person that bought the technology? Is it the person that, kind of pushed the button? Is it the person that didn't stop it? And what we see sort of in that regard is people aren't sort of refusing to take responsibility. Rather, there's definitely a legal community that's trying to figure out sort of where that responsibility lies. And a lot of it kind of comes down to this philosophy of technology, sort of if it didn't do what you intended it to do, is that your fault, And so I don't know that, I think like many things, it's going to be a very interesting, evolving debate as we look at sort of kind of who's responsible in the ethics of complicity.
So we're right at the time, 1 minute over. Thank you both so incredibly much for coming and for making such thoughtful observations. I tremendously enjoyed this. As I noted in the Q&A, a recording of this will be made live on YouTube for those who were unable to join us. And I do hope that there will be more opportunities to continue this conversation and that others would take this as an opening of a door towards a discussion about the intersectionality of queer theory in other areas of national security, intelligence being one of them, but certainly not the only one. So with that, thank you all so very much.
Thank you.